Okay, sports fans. Tonight, like every night when we have our tank talks, we have some exciting stuff tonight. Tonight we're going to break into new territory today. We're not going to talk about German tanks, thank goodness. I love German tanks, but I'm bored to death of them. And we did the Pershing last week, so this week we're going to do Russian tanks. And so we're going to talk about two tanks in particular. As you can see on the screen up here, we're going to be talking about the T-34 series and the T-34-85, and then we're going to be talking about the KV1s. So I think we'll just kind of deep dive into those. Is that okay with you, Adam?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Now, once again, let's talk about these models a little bit. These are both Forces of Valor models. And we know that the Forces of Valor make great models. They're highly detailed. They're heavy models. And I think that Forces of Valor are the only one that's made these Russian tanks. I haven't seen them in the Unimax. Well, I guess Unimax is Forces of Valor, but in the Century 21 brand. And so, as you can see, they're very highly detailed. They're quite prized. They're fairly expensive in comparison to some of the other things you can buy. So why don't we just start doing a deep dive with the T-34, and we'll talk about the KV1 later. First of all, let's talk about the elephant in the room, basically the T-34. They made a whole pile of those during World War II.
How many did they make, Doug?
Well, they made around 70,000 of them.
70,000?
70,000 between the two variants. They started making the T-34s, and that had a 70. What was the size of the gun on the T-34?
It was a 76.2 millimeter gun.
Gun, okay. I don't have I might have a. This might be a T-34. Look, magically we can have this. It's going to be flying in. That is going to be. Let's get these together here for a second. These are some little ones I bought. It was kind of fun. This is the standard T-34. Notice it has quite a bit smaller turret on it. And maybe with our fancy brand new camera, which we bought just for this purpose, you can tell that look at the size of the turrets between the T-34 and the T-34-85. And so it became apparent a little bit later in World War II that they're going to have to go with some bigger guns when the Germans started developing bigger guns. But one thing I want to talk about, first of all, is why they started developing the T-34 tank in 1934. But by the time 1939 around, they had already built 20,000 T-34 tanks. Because I think the Russians saw the writing on the wall that they were going to have some problems with the Germans down the road. Even though Hitler and Stalin were talking like brothers there for a long time, they were both building up massive armies behind their backs. They had a deal, the Russians had to deal with the Germans until the Germans invaded Poland. Okay, so they had built 20,000, and I think by the end of the war there was over 48,000 T-34s made.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Yep.
We have 48,950 T-34s.
Okay, total, good gravy. They were prolific little buggers. From 1940 to present, basically, a total of 84,070 variants have made. 35,850 of those were T-34s, and 48,950 of those were T-34-85s. So the difference between the T-34-85, they put a bigger turret in there, and it went from a 4-man crew to a 5-man crew. And they put the 85 millimeter superior gun in there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first time anybody saw a T-34 in action was, I think, in the first Battle of Barbarossa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You just killed the
Did I kill the driver?
You killed the driver, broke his neck right off. As you can see, these forces of Valor do great. They do a really good job on these tanks. They're just very, very impressive. The shock would cause Hitler to really decided that they were behind the ball game in their tank department is when they started invading Russia with the Battle of Barbarossa. What was the first battle they had? Minsk?
Bialystok Minsk was one of the first ones. It's hard to track which one was the first one of Operation Barbarossa because it was kind of a two-pronged
That's right.
encircling. And so the dates aren't exactly clear. But yeah, one of the first ones was Operation Bialystok Minsk, or Battle of Bialystok Minsk.
I just remember Minsk is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, look, this guy's hand, they make even their guys put their hands in the right places. These are nice models. Anyway, imagine, if you will, you're a German soldier.
I am a German soldier. I'm not a German soldier.
No, but just imagine, you will.
All right.
The guy that used to do the Twilight Zone, Rob Stern. Imagine, if you will, going back to the early war, 1939, and Hitler decides to invade Russia through the Minsk. No. So, as a surprise little attack, he puts together his army of 38 Ts and Panzer IIIs. And they go tearing across the Russian tundra. Well, maybe not through the Russian tundra, but they go bombing towards Russia. And all of a sudden, they're cruising down the road, and a 38T runs into a T-34. I imagine these guys about wet their pants.
Yeah, if I remember right, the 38T was like 15 tons.
15 tons, and these are 31 tons.
31 tons, twice as much.
Those would do 21 miles an hour on a good day on a road, about 10 miles an hour or less. So I'm thinking these would do 33 miles an hour and 20 miles an hour over cross country. These things could fly. That was the biggest advantage of the T-34 tanks in all the battles, especially on the open field. They were a fast, nimble tank. They had their problems. They had mechanical problems like anything else, but less than the German heavier tanks when they started coming out with them. So coming down the road, I'm going to go blow the crap out of these Russians, and you run into a T-34. The other tank that they had, and I'm not just saying that's the only one they had, but most of the tanks that they invaded, when they invaded Russia, they used mostly Panzer IIIs and T-38s, and they started introducing some Panzer IVs at that time. They were their men were highly trained, highly motivated, and they knew how to run their equipment, drive their tanks, and do very well with them. Like we'll group both the T-38Ts and the Panzer IIIs in that thing. The problem with the Russian tanks, they were a far superior tank. The armor on them, the gun on them, and everything. But they had untrained crews. And so the first Battle of Minsk, whatever it's called, was a devastating loss. And they lost like 14,000 T-34s compared to 1,800 of the Panzer IIIs. And the Panzer IIIs could just outrun them on the battlefield. There was no coordination with the Russians. Some of the tank drivers had less than 2 hours training when they went into battle.
It's insane.
Yep, even though they were a far superior gun. Now, the reason they knocked out as many Panzer T-34s as they did is that they had the Pak 36 and the Pak 40 anti-tank guns that the infantry brought with them. So, but as far as the tanks going tank to tank, I think it was a very small percentage that the tanks took out because there were stories of how 2 or 3 Panzer IIIs could sit and just at will shoot a T-34 while the the poor gunner didn't know how to shoot the gun, and the T-34 is trying to find the Panzer, and they take up to 20, 30 rounds directly, and
Right.
not even, and they turn around and drive away.
Yeah.
Without many hits on them. So they were obviously a far superior piece of equipment, but far inferior trained.
Right. It was my understanding as well that the T-34s in those opening battles of Operation Barbarossa, the T-34s didn't even have radios.
That's true.
The radios were so expensive and
They
so
only
rare.
gave them one to each of the squadrons.
Yeah, a commander was the only one who was allowed to have a radio.
And that's like
everyone else had to use flags.
They use flags. So the guy, how's you have to be in the middle of a battle with infantry, Russian, German snipers, and all that stuff around, or just the German infantry standing up, waving flags at your buddy in the tank next door? You're just, there I am.
Yeah.
You're shot. Oh my gosh. At that first battle, the Germans captured 419,000 Russian soldiers.
419,000.
419,000 Russian soldiers. And they had the infantry, and they were supposed to be at another front 2 weeks later. And they showed up at the German army showed up a week late because they stayed behind to execute all 419,000 soldiers.
You're telling me that they were so busy executing people that they were late to their rendezvous?
Yes. And the general over those ones that stayed late, or the commanding officer, I don't remember his name. I should be better prepared. I got so excited about doing the specifications of the tanks, I forgot about how they're used. But the commanding officer actually got demoted because he showed up a week late because it took him too long to execute 419,000 Russian soldiers.
Not just Russian soldiers either.
Oh, men, women, and children.
Men, women, and children.
Yeah, take no prisoners. And
so it was
that really pissed off the Russians.
Yeah, that
was a bad thing for them to do that.
Yeah, the Operation Barbarossa, the opening scenes of the war against on the Eastern Front
were horrific.
Yeah, really set the population of Russia against the population of Germany in ways that the Germans would soon grow to regret.
They thought the way it went at the Battle of Minsk, that they thought they were going to be able to run over. They had a timetable to get to Moscow in 45 days. Right. They thought they could just run over. It's just, boy, this is going to be easy, despite all their big fancy tanks. But nope, they murdered everybody, and they got their heads together and ticked the Russians off to the point where they fought with a vengeance against those murdering Nazis. And they were able to thwart them from invading Moscow. Yep. And St. Petersburg. They never did get to the streets of St. Petersburg. They got within a few kilometers of it. But even though the Germans had, but one of the main reasons they never got to Moscow was the T-34s.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the transition from the T-34 with the T-34-76, or the original T-34,
right, to
the T-34-85.
Oh, yes. So, they started showing up. Okay, go ahead. So
in 1943, just as at this moment in 1939, the Germans had to completely change their strategy because of the T-34. The Russians would do the same thing with the advent of the Panther.
Hitler copied the T-34 basically to come up with the Panther. Even a little bit bigger, but not that they weighed about the same actually. But they were.
And you can see lots of the same design cues here. Similar slope glacis, bigger turret. And the armor was thicker on the Panther. It was so much thicker, and the gun was so much better that the T-34-76 was deemed inadequate.
That's correct. So thus, we don't have a model of this regular, except for this little guy right here.
Yeah.
So this is a T-34-85 But so now the T-34-85 could go toe-to-toe with a Panther.
Right. And the T-34-85 had an 85 millimeter gun. It was upgunned. It was up armored. They moved from at most 60 millimeters of armor to 90 millimeters of armor.
That's when they designed the new turret and went to a 5-man crew.
Mm-hmm.
And they added another
3-man turret. Yep,
a 3-man turret. And they got so they could go from shooting 2 or 3 rounds per minute to 15 rounds a minute.
Wow.
When they got the new turret. Now, in concurrent development, a different tank guy came up with the Tiger tank.
Right, and the Tiger was German's first heavy tank.
It was the first heavy tank. But they both were designed to counteract the T-34, which eventually turned into T-34-85. Now, let's talk about the KV1 a little bit.
Let's do it.
Okay, this one's heavy too.
Once again, going back in time to 1940, 39.
1940. Now, they didn't build the KV1s in the numbers, of course, of the T-34s. But you can see it's a heavy tank. It comes in at, they came in at 44 tons.
44 tons.
Versus 31 tons. So it's half again heavier. And it's way up armored. They went up to 120 millimeters of armor, 90 millimeters on the side, and 80 millimeters in the back. And it had a 5-man crew. It had the same 75 millimeter gun, and it was up to the 85 about the same time as they did the T-34s. But they had only built 2,200 total of the KV1s, and then it was superseded in the middle of the war by the IS series tanks. They made a T-34-85, which is the one that they put the 85 millimeter tank. So they
mean a KV1, KV-85?
The KV-85, yeah. Not KV-185, but KV-85. Then they made an ugly bugger. There's a KV-2. Oh my gosh, what an ugly tank. And they only built 210, right? 210. And going back to the KV-1, 5,219. So they only built 250 of the KV-2s, which is good because they scared people just because they were so ugly. And then
they definitely win on ugliness factor.
Yeah, and they went to a great big gun on that thing. Also, they made a flamethrower version of that thing. These flames would shoot out 275 feet, almost the length of a football field on that thing. And that was the KV-1IS. Or KV-2. They made a KV-2, KV-8, and a KV-1IS. They made 4 variants of the KV-2.
So this KV-2
it came in at 45 tons, where the KV-1 was 41 tons.
44 tons.
44 tons. They're only a ton difference?
Yeah. The difference between the KV-1 and the KV-2 is that the KV-1 has a 76 millimeter gun. The KV-2 has...
KV-2 is 52 tons versus
52.
41 tons.
Okay. The KV-2 has a 152 millimeter gun.
Yes, they weigh up. I was going to say that because just look at the snout on that thing.
Yeah, that would be the largest, I think the largest main armament
of the war.
The Sturm Tiger had a huge armament too, but it's a different. Yeah, it's a different kind of.
But what did the Jagd Tiger have in it?
That was 122.
122, and this is 155. You said
152.
Yeah, 152. And I didn't read anywhere if it was effective, if it did anything. I think it was so heavy, just got.
It was so heavy. They only built 210. They quickly abandoned it.
Yeah.
And went with the lot more common T-34-85s or the IS. The IS-2 would be a 122 millimeter gun.
Yeah.
And so they decided that 122 was sufficient, and at least it was in a good tank. Whereas, I mean, if you look at this, That armor is just asking to be shot at.
Yep. It's hard to miss that one.
The
I could even probably hit that one by 22.
Yeah, tank designs really favored low profiles, and that was not a low profile tank.
Nope. Well, and they built 5,200 KV1s, but happy versus 70,000 of the T-34s and 45,000 T-34-85s
During the war.
during the war. And so obviously they had to do something.
And when we were looking it up, the T-34, given that it was produced after World War II, so there was probably an additional 10,000 built after World War II, and it participated in 22 separate engagements from World War II to present.
Yeah, they've been using them in the Ukrainian war, from what you read.
Yeah, they were engaged in the Donbass region back when in 2014 when that first Donbass region was having issues, and I'm sure there's T-34s being used in the Ukrainian war.
We know they're using IS-2s and IS-3s around.
So the T-34 would end up being the most produced tank in World War II, and the second most produced ever in the history of tanks.
They made more T-34s than Shermans?
They did.
Wow. Oh, they did. Oh, but you're considering the T-34 and the T-34-85 variants together.
Correct.
But I still think the T-34-85s, they still built more of those than the Shermans.
I think that's correct, yeah. Because didn't they build 40,000 Shermans?
Yeah. Around 39,000 something.
Yeah, and they built over 40,000 T-34-85s.
Wait, if I recall what we said a few minutes ago, they built like 48,950 of them, and then they built how many KVs, or how many just straight T-34s in front of that?
35,000.
So what was the total? 89,000? 90,000 freaking tanks?
Yeah, 90,000 freaking tanks.
Holy smokes, that's a lot of tonnage. Can you imagine the machinery and the factories and the logistics to build 90,000 tanks in, say, 5 years?
Yeah. And not only did they do that,
they had to move the factories.
They had to move the factories because of Operation Barbarossa. They had to move the factories
from St. Petersburg to...
because they were in St. Petersburg, which, to those of you who don't know Russian geography, is in the west of Russia.
Right.
It's on the German side of Russia. So they had to move it far east into the Ural Mountains so that they could protect their tank factories.
Man, I remember reading that when we're talking about Crump and those guys. Was one of the other things they're doing. They actually had to move lock, stock, and factory and the workers.
Yep.
And it was like 60,000 workers, and they've had to unbolt these huge factories. They're producing 20 or 30 T-34s a day, move those things 1,500 miles east, build them all up, and I had them running like in 3 months.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And not only did they do that, but over the course of the war, they cut the cost. I can't remember the degree to which they cut the cost, but they cut the speed of production in half, despite improving the capabilities. They upgunned it. They up-armored it.
They up-horsepowered it.
They up-horsepowered it.
I remember an article where they said they started using when they first started building, they're building it using a tractor transmission and an axle that they're building with these big Russian tractors. And then during the course of the war, they designed one specifically for the T-34, and it also increased the speed, reduced the cost, and the reliability of it.
Right.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, so they were able to produce just ungodly amounts. So it was the most produced tank in World War II. And it was the second most produced tank ever in the history of tanks.
Well, who built more than 90,000 tanks?
The Russians did. Later.
Well, after World War II.
After World War II.
Like 272 or no?
No, the T-55.
Oh, the T-55s. I forgot about those. Were that was a Korean War era.
Yeah, during the Cold War era.
Yeah, Cold War. How many? Geez, if they built more than 90,000, how many did they build? That's They're tank happy over there.
They are, in fact, tank happy. You have another story you wanted to tell.
Did I tell you about that story a little bit? Okay, this is a fun story. This is not anything to do with war or anything. I had the honor of taking a scout troop, the very first scout troop from the United States to Russia, from the Utah National Parks Council, Special Ops Troop 591 is what we called ourselves, over to Russia in 1993. And we went out to the Perm region, and we ended up camping in a campground. It was the first all-in-Russian camp, and there was over 1,100 Russian scout leaders and Russian scouts. And the Russians had both boys and girl scouts. They didn't separate the two. And I took 16 Boy Scouts over there from the United BSA and Utah National Parks Council. Well, one day, one of the scout leaders who we got to know over there, Russian scout leader, he came out, hey, we're going to go on a field trip. And we said, okay, let's follow you. And this whole trip over there would make a great movie, by the way. I'll write it up. Anyway, so we get on this big old military transport bus thing. It was one of these big, huge, like mine thing, had like 10-foot diameter wheels and hold about 50 people in the back, and it go over swamps and everything. We head for a town called Congur, Kungur, out in the Perm region. Mm. And they had a big cathedral there that was a prison for 75 years, and they were making it back into a cathedral. But in their town square, they had a tank. And we went and took some pictures around the tank, and we thought, well, that's really fun. They have a World War II tank there. Yep. Well, I wanted, when we were doing the research for the T-34s, I said, I wonder what tank it is. And I found the actual picture of the tank in the town square in the World War II Memorial of Congar, and it's a T-34, and the numbers on it is 232. And I had pictures of it here a little while ago, and my computer had a brain freeze, not a brain fart, but a brain freeze. Mm-hmm. And it take me too long to find it, but I actually found a picture of the T-34 80, and it's a T-34 85. We verified that. It's sitting in the town square at Congar. And my scouts climbed all over that in 1993, and I actually felt it. And I remember specifically going up and hitting my hand on the turret, mm-hmm. and just seeing how freaking solid that thing was. So I've had a personal experience with the T-34. That's awesome. Yeah, it's great. For those of us who are too young to remember, how close was that to the end of the Cold War? Oh, right at the end of the Cold War. I think the Cold War ended in 1991. No, 1989. Okay. And then 1990. And then somehow we invited a Russian scout troop to come over here in 1991. And they invited us to go back in 1993. So we brought them over. Mm-hmm. We paid for them to come over here. My district and council did. That was a really neat experience for us too. Yeah. And then so we got to know them. And then in turn, when they decided to have their first Russian encampment, they invited a troop from our council there. And luckily, I was in a position to be asked to be the scout master for the. Well, that's awesome. So within 4 years of the Cold War ending. Yeah. So what happened after so we have the KV1, but it sounds like they moved away from it. What did they move to? They went to an IS-1. IS-1. And that was basically a derivative off of the KV1 chassis. Okay. They upped the engine up to 750 horsepower. And I think they reduced the weight of it a little bit somehow because they put a cast turret on it instead of the sheet metal, the big thick sheet metal turret on it. And the IS-1 led way to the IS-2, which was a really good tank. And the only IS-2 I have, there we have an IS-2, and then we'll do a little shrinking problem. There, we just shrunk our KV1 down. You can see that the chassis of those are very similar, but they took basically the same turret, just expanded it, made it a six-man crew off of see how similar the turrets are? They spread them out a little bit and put a great big 122 millimeter gun, which is one of the largest guns in the war. And did we ever find out how many they made?
Yeah. Of the IS-1s, they made 207. It was the IS-1 was
prototype.
It was mostly a prototype. The IS-2, which was really the one that was more fielded, was 3,854.
Yeah, so they made enough that they were towards the end of the war. And I think, from what I understand, the IS-2 was a pretty good tank. They solved a lot of the issues they had with the KV1s, put a lot better gun, a lot bigger turret, and beefed it up enough to handle the extra weight. And that was their premier heavy tank throughout the war. I mean, towards the end of the war.
So which of these tanks is your favorite, Doug?
Out of all the Russian tanks?
The Russian tanks, which is your favorite Russian tank?
You're gonna think this is funny. I would say I got two, but I'll narrow it down to one. I really love the little T-34, 85. And I like it even better now that I remember I touched one and climbed up. I didn't climb up it, but I helped a lot of my scouts climb around it. To wrap things up, the KV1 wasn't that successful in the war. They built 2,000, 2,200 of them, but it was successful enough that it led into the IS series tanks, which turned out to be a better, heavier tank, and we're able to take the King Tigers and the Tigers and the Panthers one-on-one a lot better.
Start again. You can. Continue.
Okay. Anyway, so you look at the development from the war. Just look at Operation Barbarossa. They start out with a 30-18. We got past that. This was kind of one of the Germans. They developed these. Actually, Czechoslovakia did the 30-18, and then they morphed the 30-18 into a Panzer III. And then during Operation Barbarossa, these two run into this and this, and they go, holy crap. It'd be interesting to quote some of the German officers, what they said about the Panzer, the T-34s and the KV1s when they first ran. Didn't they call them the gargantuan?
Yeah, and wonder tanks.
And there's no way they were going to ever defeat them. And they didn't know how to drive them at the time. But anyway, so they were worried about. And then those will go away. And we're going to put these over here. And the metamorphosis of the mother of invention, they moved into the Tiger 1, which is probably the most infamous tank of World War II, if you really think about it. When you think of the nasty Russian tanks, you think of a Tiger 1. I mean, just a bad, ominous tank. And the Panther tanks. And Hitler's engineers blatantly copied the T-34 when they did one in the Panther tank. And I mean, they just, why is that so good? We want to build one. And when they actually built them, they hurried it up so fast that they were a mechanical failure for the first year. In fact, the first Battle of Kursk, K-U-R-S-T. S-K. Kursk. They delayed starting the operation for the Battle of Kursk by 2.5 months, while they were trying to get enough Panther tanks to the front to help spearhead it in. But in those 2 months, the Russians dug in. There was hundreds of thousands of Russians out there. They were digging in, making tank traps and digging in hard. And they were burying a lot of their T-34s and making these walls of tanks. And I read some journals from some German tank commanders, particularly a Tiger tank commander. He says, you can't believe those Russians are And they were mad. They didn't like the Russians
Sure.
because of the atrocities they did at the first of their.
You mean the Russians didn't like the Germans?
The Russians didn't like the Germans because of what we talked about.
Yeah, the atrocities.
The atrocities. They massacred 419,000 men, soldiers, and civilians because they didn't want to bother with them.
Right.
Why they wanted to have peace. So they were fighting for their countrymen, but they copied that, and it just, I just think how one tank begats another, another one begats another,
Right.
you know, and they just keep going until the improvements, you know, like my dad, who's an architect, he said necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
And I think this is a really good
example.
They start out with this and end up with the Tiger, and eventually one.
Yeah, just look at this size comparison here between the 38T and the Tiger and the KV1. It's
and
just
magically appear the Tiger 2.
Tiger 2. It's just insanity.
Okay. From this to this in 3 years. They developed these in 36, 37 when they weren't supposed to. That's because they did them in Czechoslovakia and they were violating the accords they made in World War One. But so that round of those, Hitler says, "Oh no, we got to redesign everything. Run, run, run." Oh, what I was talking about, the reliability issues with the Panther, and this isn't the time to talk about it, but out of the first 400 they made, 34, 17% made it to the front line.
It's insanity.
They lost 17%. I mean, they only had 17% make it to the battle between the factory and the battle.
What's so astonishing about this is this seems like it's almost a different scale.
Yeah.
It's so much smaller. It seems like, that's got to be like a 30-second scale or something. No, that's the right scale.
Like 48 scale.
Right.
48 scale versus 30-second scale.
30-second scale. No.
This is a 30-second scale tank.
And so are these.
Yeah. And there were some interchange in there. You know, they came up with the 4
right
in the middle of it.
Sure.
You know, so, you know, and see, the Russians didn't have the stepping stones that the Germans had to go through. They were smarter about it. They stuck and perfected. And, you know, we've only scratched the surface. You know, if any of you watching this video, you know, if we whetted your appetite about wanting a little thirst to go learn something, I hope that's the case, because we sure as heck didn't go into depth enough to even know. But I know enough that technology is advanced in war at a exponentially faster rate than it ever is during peace times.
Mm-hmm.
Do a pan over there. Say goodbye to the KV2. Say goodbye to the KV1, and the star of the night, the T-34, and its different derivatives.
Good night, everybody.
Subscribe, damn it.